I don't think I've ever told anybody, but now I've told everyone.
Why Bowie?
I don't know. I mean, I was 12.
You never told anyone, but now I've told the whole world. Why Bowie? I don't know. I was only 12 back then. At just 12 years old, Scarlett Johansson had never stood before a director so legendary. But the man in front of her didn't yell or scold. He bent down to meet her eyes and softly said something that made her laugh. And in that fleeting moment, she gave him a silly, private nickname one no one else on Earth had ever heard. 27 years later, before millions of television viewers, Scarlett finally revealed that secret one she had kept buried for nearly 3 decades, locked away in a memory that belonged only to the two of them. A small hidden world she kept sealed in her heart, one she only opened after that man had left this world. But how could a 12-year-old girl have touched the heart of a Hollywood legend? What led to that moment between them? The answer awaits you in the next part of this video. New York in 1984 was nothing like a Disney movie. The city blazed with neon lights, choked with exhaust fumes, and echoed with the constant wail of sirens. And somewhere amidst that restless crowd, a little blonde girl was born into an artistic yet far from wealthy family. Scarlett Ingrid Johansson, a name that would one day appear on hundreds of movie posters, was then just the 4th child in a family of 6, living in a cramped Manhattan apartment, where the living room doubled as a bedroom and the kitchen was only 2 steps away from the bed. Her mother, Melanie Sloan, was a theater enthusiast and a small-time Broadway producer. Her father, Karsten Johansson, was a Danish architect who believed art nourished the soul, even if it didn't always pay the rent on time. The Johanssons had no fortune, no fame, but they possessed a different kind of treasure stacks of old VHS tapes, discounted theater tickets, and an unshakable belief that art could make the impossible possible. From the moment she could speak, Scarlett loved to perform in the middle of the living room, wrapping herself in a towel like a ball gown, clutching a toothbrush as a microphone, and singing to an audience made up entirely of her teddy bears. She was captivated by everything about Broadway: the dazzling lights, the thunderous applause, and the way strangers could laugh or cry from a single line of dialogue. No one in the family thought it was just a childish game. They knew this little girl was different. Scarlett lived inside her roles as if they were real worlds, and that burning desire pushed her beyond the walls of their tiny apartment toward the bright stage lights she had always dreamed of. But there are no shortcuts to Hollywood dreams. At 9 years old, Scarlett began stepping into the world of casting, a place where tears and disappointment were mandatory lessons. Every audition was a battlefield, dozens of little girls with perfect curls, perfect smiles, and parents in sunglasses waiting in cold, endless hallways. Scarlett was smaller, plainer, and by the standards of the time, nothing special. She landed a few minor gigs, a milk commercial, a supporting role in a school play, a bit part in a TV movie no one remembers. But there was one thing the directors couldn't ignore: her eyes. Scarlett had the eyes of someone who had lived far more than her years, eyes that could tell a story without a single word. Her mother often told her, "You don't have to be the loudest girl in the room. Just be the one they can't look away from." Scarlett believed her. She kept auditioning, kept hearing no over and over again, and each time she walked out of that audition room, she held her head a little higher. Once, after another failed audition, Scarlett asked her mother, "Did I do something wrong?" Her mother smiled. "No, honey. They're just not ready to see you yet." And then the moment arrived. One autumn morning in 1997, Scarlett walked into a room that felt different. No harsh lights, no cold stares, just one silver-haired man with eyes that were both stern and gentle, watching her every move. That man didn't just see a little girl auditioning, he saw an artist beginning to take shape. A few weeks later, the call came, the one that would change everything. We'd like to invite Scarlett Johansson to join the cast of The Horse Whisperer. No one in the Johansson family knew that phone call would alter their lives forever. The role of Grace McLean wasn't just a turning point in Scarlett's career. It was the moment she met the man who saw what the world had overlooked. The man she would one day call by a silly, tender nickname filled with gratitude: Bowie. October 1997. Scarlett had just turned 12, unaware that she was about to step into one of the most defining moments of her life. After dozens of failed auditions and countless thank you, we'll be in touch that never led anywhere, something about this one felt different. The audition room wasn't crowded or cold like all the others. There weren't rows of little girls waiting for their turn, no impatient directors checking their watches. Instead, at the far end of the room, a silver-haired man sat quietly observing her. He didn't speak, didn't frown, didn't smile, he just looked. And that gaze was so deep, so steady, that Scarlett felt as if he could see right through her thoughts. That man was Robert Redford, and that audition marked the beginning of a lifelong bond. The film was The Horse Whisperer, a gentle yet profound story about healing after tragedy centered on Grace McLean, a young girl who survives a horrific riding accident and carries invisible wounds in her heart. Scarlett came to audition for Grace. She wasn't the only name on the list that day, but when she stood before the camera, something extraordinary happened. Scarlett didn't just act, she became Grace. Every furrow of her brow, every trembling breath felt so real that the entire crew fell silent, the kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they've just witnessed something rare. Redford felt it too. He didn't see a promising child actress, as the papers would later call her. He saw a soul of astonishing depth hidden inside the body of a 12-year-old girl. And so Scarlett was chosen, not because she was perfect, but because she was true. On the set of The Horse Whisperer, Robert Redford was more than a director, more than a co-star. He was a guide. Hollywood can be a cold place for young talent, where one bad take can end a fragile career before it begins. But Redford did the opposite. He created a safe space for Scarlett, a world where she could try, fail, stumble, and rise again without fear of judgment. When Scarlett struggled with an emotional crying scene, Redford didn't shout, "Cut, do it again," like so many others would. Instead, he took her aside and told her a quiet story from his childhood about the day he lost his beloved dog and how he hid his tears from the grown-ups. When she returned to the camera, Scarlett didn't perform the scene anymore. She lived it, and it became one of the most authentic moments in the entire film. He guided her patiently through every detail: how to stand, how to hold silence before the lens, how a single look could tell an entire story. But more importantly, he let her discover her own instincts. "Don't try to act like an adult," he once told her. "Just be honest with what you feel." In that freedom, Scarlett didn't just complete her first major role, she grew up. Throughout the shoot, Redford became more than a mentor. He became a father figure, someone she could turn to whenever she felt scared or uncertain. Hollywood can be merciless to child actors. Its bright lights can burn young souls. But with Redford, Scarlett felt safe. "He didn't just teach me how to act," she said years later in an interview. "He taught me how to listen, how to trust myself." And it was in that warmth that the nickname Bowie was born. No one remembers the exact moment she said it, maybe after a tough scene, maybe when he told a joke that made her laugh uncontrollably. But from that moment on, Bowie wasn't just a silly word. It became a secret code between two hearts, between a teacher who saw potential and a girl who found a place of belonging. Bowie, it sounds like the name of a teddy bear from a toy store. And in truth, that's exactly how Redford appeared in Scarlett's eyes. A gentle giant, a soft guardian who always stood behind her ready to shield her from the storms of fame. Years later, when Scarlett had become one of the most powerful stars in Hollywood, she still carried the memory of that first film close to her heart, not because it launched her career, but because it was where she met the first person who believed in her more than she believed in herself. And perhaps from the moment a 12-year-old girl called a Hollywood legend Bowie, both their lives quietly took a new turn toward a path where talent blossomed and affection endured forever. The Horse Whisperer ended to the sound of applause from critics and audiences alike. But for Scarlett Johansson, it was more than just a film. It was the first door that opened toward the path she had dreamed of since those days singing before her stuffed animals in a cramped Manhattan apartment. And once she walked through that door, she never looked back. From her role as Grace McLean's Scarlett began a journey few child actors ever complete. Just a few years later, she appeared in Ghost World 2001, a small role but one that made critics take notice of the emotional depth hiding within this teenage girl. Then came Lost in Translation 2003, Sofia Coppola's quiet masterpiece that turned Scarlett into a global sensation. At 19, she was no longer a promising young actress, she was a star. From there, her ascent never stopped. Matchpoint Vicky Cristina Barcelona, her Lucy Marriage Story, and of course her iconic turn as Black Widow, which placed her among the pantheon of Marvel's cinematic heroes. With her beauty, charisma, and astonishing versatility, Scarlett became one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood, topping Forbes' list for years in a row. And yet, amid the flashes, red carpets, and golden statues, there was one thing she never forgot. Everything began with Bowie. Across dozens of interviews throughout her career, whenever asked who had the greatest influence on her craft, she never hesitated. Robert Redford. He wasn't just the first director who believed in me, he was the one who taught me to believe in myself. In a talk show, Scarlett once revealed that before every major project she had a small ritual. She would rewatch a few minutes of The Horse Whisperer. Not to study her acting, but to remind herself that this career didn't begin with fame or million-dollar contracts. It began with a man who once bent down to her eye level and said, "You can do this." Scarlett also shared that Redford was one of the few people in Hollywood who never sought gratitude or recognition. He never said, "I did this for you," or "You wouldn't be here without me." He was just quietly there, guiding me, protecting me, and then stepping back when I was ready to walk on my own. And that's exactly why. I owe him more than I could ever say. She smiled softly. I still call him Bowie, even in my 30s and 40s. Sometimes he teases me, "Scarlett, aren't you gonna change that nickname?" But the truth is, I can't. Because to me, Bowie isn't just a name. It's memory. It's trust. It's my entire childhood wrapped in two silly little syllables. Scarlett wasn't the only one who owed something to Robert Redford. To filmmakers, he was more than a legendary actor or an Oscar-winning director. He was a man who opened doors for countless talents the world might have otherwise missed. Redford didn't just fund, he mentored, encouraged, and created spaces where others could try, fail, and ultimately shine. To him, young talent was never a threat. It was the future, and he wanted that future to have room to grow. In one rare interview about his filmmaking philosophy, Redford said, fame doesn't matter as much as how many doors you've opened for others. And true to his words, his greatest legacy isn't found on the silver screen, it lives in the hearts of those he touched. Scarlett Johansson may be the most vivid testament to Robert Redford's legacy, but to understand why he could see the light in a 12-year-old girl the world overlooked, we have to go back in time before he was Bowie, before he was the mentor, the founder of Sundance, the Hollywood legend. He was simply Bobby, a restless boy growing up in California with a heart that always beat a little faster than the world around him. Robert Redford was born on a summer day in August 1936 in Santa Monica, a city of sunlight, sea breeze, and big dreams. His family was so ordinary that no one could have imagined they would one day raise a cinematic legend. His father was an accountant, his mother a homemaker. No one in the family had any connection to the arts, and Hollywood to them felt as distant as the moon. But one thing was certain: from a young age, Robert was not an easy child. He hated sitting still in class, despised dry numbers, and often disappeared from his desk just to go explore the beach near his home. Teachers called him a troublemaker. His friends called him an adventurer. Redford called himself a dreamer, though at the time even he didn't know what he was dreaming of. When he was just 14, Redford once climbed over a fence to sneak into a local baseball stadium so he could paint graffiti. When he got caught, instead of panicking, he grinned and asked the police officer if he could repaint the wall properly. That was Redford's stubborn, bold, and always seeing the world in his own way. And that very streak of rebellion would later become the spark that carried him further than anyone could have imagined. After high school, Redford did something that terrified parents of his generation. He dropped out of college. Classrooms and routines weren't meant for him. He wanted to live not through textbooks, but through streets, people, and stories. With a few dollars in his pocket and a suitcase full of paint, Redford set off for Europe. He sketched on the streets of Paris, took odd jobs in Spain, and slept on friends' couches in Italy. Life as a 20-year-old wanderer wasn't easy. There were times he thought about giving up and returning to America. But those drifting years taught him something no school ever could: how to observe the world. He learned that everyone has a story, every wrinkle carries a memory, and every glance is a line of dialogue waiting to be written. When he finally returned to the United States, Redford brought back not only a sketchbook filled with scenes from Europe, but also a deep emotional reservoir, one that would later fuel his every performance. The turning point came when he decided to try his luck on stage. At first they were nameless, tiny roles in New York plays, but gradually the stage lights began to find him. One director remarked, "Redford doesn't act like an actor, he lives like a character." And from that moment, Hollywood began to notice. By the late 1960s, Robert Redford had exploded onto the cinematic horizon, not with a small step, but with a bang. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid 1969 wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural phenomenon. His role as the Sundance Kid, the cool, witty, charming outlaw, turned Redford from the adventurous boy from Santa Monica into an A-list star overnight. And he didn't stop there. The Sting 1973 earned him an Oscar nomination. All the President's Men 1976 became a landmark film about investigative journalism. And Out of Africa 1985 cemented his place at the top of Hollywood's golden era. Redford wasn't just one of the most sought-after actors, he became the face of Hollywood's ideal: strength, intelligence, grace, and relentless forward motion. A critic once said if Hollywood were a school, Redford would be the troublemaker who somehow became an honorary professor. And indeed, from a college dropout sketching his way across Europe, he had become a man who defined an entire chapter of American cinema. But what made Redford truly extraordinary wasn't his fame. Amid the glare of Hollywood's lights, he never lost his rebellious spirit, nor the heart of a storyteller. And it was that heart that led him to his next great role, not just as a performer, but as a creator of opportunity. For most Hollywood stars, reaching the pinnacle of their career often marks the end of their struggle, the long-awaited reward after years of chasing success. But for Robert Redford, the spotlight was never a finish line. It was merely the starting point for something far greater. While the world admired him as one of the most gifted actors of his generation, Redford began doing what few dared to do. He set out to change the very industry that had made him a legend. By the late 1970s, Hollywood was deep in the era of the blockbuster. The louder, the flashier, the more expensive a film was, the better it performed at the box office. Amid the frenzy, Redford sensed something dangerous. The quiet, personal, artistically driven stories, the kind that spoke to the human spirit, were disappearing from the big screen. Cinema isn't just entertainment, he once said. It's how we hold up a mirror and see ourselves. From that conviction, Redford decided to build something new, a haven for young directors, bold dreamers, and all those the Hollywood system had shut out. And so in 1978, nestled among the snow-capped mountains of Utah, the Sundance Film Festival was born. At first, Sundance was small and unassuming, almost invisible to the industry. But Redford nurtured it like a patient gardener. Year after year, he invited young filmmakers, funded projects no studio would touch, and personally mentored those taking their first steps behind the camera. The result, Sundance became the sanctuary of independent cinema. It was here that Quentin Tarantino premiered Reservoir Dogs, sparking a revolution in art house violence. The Coen brothers unveiled Blood Simple, establishing their darkly ironic signature style. Darren Aronofsky stunned audiences with Pi. Damien Chazelle found his first investors for Whiplash. They all had one thing in common: they started at the door Robert Redford opened. More than a festival, Sundance became a symbol of creative freedom, a place where art didn't bow to profit and ideas weren't strangled by mass appeal. If Hollywood was the vast sky, Sundance was the launchpad that sent new stars soaring into it. Even as he built a foundation for future generations, Redford continued to push his own boundaries. He stepped behind the camera with a confidence and precision that surprised even his admirers. His directorial debut, Ordinary People, 1980, a quiet, emotionally raw portrait of family and grief, was hailed by critics and earned him the Academy Award for Best Director. Many were astonished. Redford already had everything an actor could dream of. Why start over from zero? The answer was simple: he was never satisfied with enough. Redford wanted to tell stories his own way, with honesty, humanity, and depth, and he did it not for trophies, but for the pure love of cinema. Beyond the film set, he took on yet another role, that of a social activist. For decades, Redford has been a leading voice for environmental protection, championing conservation and climate action. He funded projects to preserve the Rocky Mountain ecosystem, partnered with international organizations to protect clean water sources, and used his fame to draw attention to causes governments too often ignored. He also became an outspoken advocate for human rights and freedom of expression. Redford never hesitated to criticize policies he believed were wrong, and he lived by one unshakable principle: an artist's duty isn't just to tell stories, it's to care about the world those stories come from. With all this, Robert Redford transcended the title of movie star. He wasn't merely the man in front of the camera, he was the one who built the stage. Not just a dreamer chasing the lights, but the one who created the sky where others could shine. In September 2025, as autumn brushed the western coast of the United States, a quiet yet heavy piece of news rippled across the world. Robert Redford had passed away in his sleep at the age of 89. No grand announcement, no spectacle, just peace the way he had lived. Hollywood fell silent. The press called him the last legend of the golden generation. Filmmakers described him as the man who taught the world how to tell stories with light. The President of the United States issued a statement of mourning. And across the industry, those who had once worked beside him shared memories of quiet advice of the times he secretly helped fund a project without ever asking for his name in the credits. But perhaps the most heartfelt farewell came from someone who had once barely reached his shoulder on a Montana film set, Scarlett Johansson. A few days after the news broke, Scarlett appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. She wore a simple black dress, no elaborate makeup, her eyes filled with sorrow yet shining with gratitude. When Colbert asked what Redford had meant to her life, she smiled softly. "I used to call him Bowie." The audience laughed. Colbert laughed. Scarlett laughed too. But then her voice softened. "I don't know why I called him that. I guess I was 12 and it was just some silly name I came up with. But I never told anyone. Never. It was something that belonged only to the two of us." In that moment, millions watching could almost see her younger self again. Grace McLean, the wide-eyed girl from The Horse Whisperer, smiling shyly as the silver-haired man before her bent down and said, "You can do this." Bowie. It sounded like nothing special, not a grand nickname, not something you'd give to a legend. But within those two tender syllables lived an entire universe of feeling trust, protection, gratitude, and a quiet kind of love that never needed to be named. To Scarlett, Bowie wasn't just a mentor. He was the launchpad of her career, the first person who taught her to believe in herself, the unseen hand behind every milestone that followed. Every major role, every award, every red carpet, there was a trace of him somewhere in it all. But more than her career, Bowie had taught her how to be a person. He showed her that the stage lights would fade, the fame would pass, but kindness and integrity, if you nurture them, would live on through the people you touch. And that's exactly what he left behind. When Robert Redford departed, he didn't just leave behind legendary performances, Oscars, or a world-renowned film festival. He left behind hundreds, maybe thousands of people he had inspired. The young directors who once huddled nervously at Sundance now stood on Oscar stages. The unknown actors he once encouraged had become global stars. And the trembling 12-year-old girl from that Montana casting room had become one of the most powerful actresses on Earth. Each of them, in their own way, carried a piece of Robert Redford in their hearts. Perhaps that's why the name Bowie made people laugh through their tears. It wasn't just a childhood joke. It was proof that the greatest things often begin with the simplest gestures: a warm look, a reassuring hand on the shoulder, or two small, silly syllables whispered by a little girl to a man she admired. At Robert Redford's farewell, there were no fireworks, no long speeches, only the sound of applause from those whose lives he had touched, and the upward gaze of a generation filled with gratitude. Scarlett was there too. She didn't give a eulogy. She didn't need to. She simply placed a small photograph on his gravestone, the two of them on the set of The Horse Whisperer in 1998, a smiling little girl, and the man bending down to fix her messy hair. On the back, she had written just one short line: "Thank you, Bowie, for believing in me before I believed in myself." And truly, there was nothing more left to say. Robert Redford once said, "Cinema doesn't change the world, but it can change people, and people can." He lived his entire life by that belief. And by changing a 12-year-old girl named Scarlett Johansson, by opening doors for thousands of young artists, he changed the world of cinema one person at a time. Bowie, two silly syllables that now hold an entire universe of love, has become the symbol of something both simple and profound, the power of faith and kindness. And as long as stories continue to be told, as long as films continue to be made and dreams continue to be passed on, Robert Redford will live on not only on the silver screen, but in the hearts of everyone he ever touched. And what about you? What do you think defines the immortal legacy of Robert Redford, his iconic performances that took the world's breath away, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more heartfelt, surprising, and inspiring stories from the world of Hollywood.